right. All right, thank you everybody for joining us today. So my name is Brittany and I'm the coordinator for the Crow Wing County Master Gardener Volunteer Program. And we have Dan Lee joining us from Arizona. So he's zooming live to the library, and we also have a pretty good chunk of people joining us on Zoom. So I'm just gonna kind of wait a couple of minutes while they get on Zoom, and then Dan will take it away. Good turnout, lots of interest in hydroponic gardening. Yeah, the weather, everybody's thinking spring, they said. Starting plants. I'll send out the handout one more time, because I don't know if it goes before I open it up. All right. All right, so we have noon. So without further ado, I'll kick off the presentation. We have Dan Lee, University of Minnesota Extension Master Gardener Volunteer, joining us today. Dan has been a Master Gardener since 2019, Dan?
Correct.
He grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota and farmed with his parents, and then spent over 30 years practicing corporate law. And he's excited to get back into his first passion of growing things. Dan is the chairman of the Community Giving Project that we do in Crow Wing County, which hosts Gardening 101 for adults, and also donated over 4,000 pounds of food this last year. So take it away, Dan.
Well, welcome everybody. And I'm hopeful that today I will take some of the mystique out of hydroponic gardening, because I think it's an intimidating term that sometimes puts people off. They think it's too complicated. There's too many issues with it that they don't try it. And I've been doing it for about 15 years now, using a variety of different methods and hydroponic gardens with quite a bit of success, but also some failures. And hopefully today I can steer you away from some of those failures. So the object today is to describe what a hydroponic garden is, the various types of hydroponic gardens. There's 4 main categories, and I'll go through those in detail. Talk a little bit about the general operations of hydroponic gardens, some of the benefits of operating them, and there are many benefits to operating them, but there are also several negatives. Just like anything, it's not perfect. The one thing that I do want to point out at the beginning, I'm not going to cover aquaponics, which is when you add fish to the mix, and I'm not going to really cover where to purchase supplies for hydroponic gardening. So with that, I'm going to start with the picture that is on the screen. And I chose this picture for a reason. It is the most common type of hydroponic garden that people think of. They've all seen many, many ads on TV and print media of a hydroponic garden that looks like this. And it looks so inviting, especially this time of year when it's cold outside and you can't really be out in your garden. The idea of having something like this in your kitchen where you can pick fresh plants during the winter is just, you know, a wonderful idea. But if you really think about it and look at this picture, it has strawberry plants. It's probably the most prolific strawberry I think I've ever seen. It's got lettuce right next to the strawberries. It's got basil plants in the back. It's got rosemaries and mints, and then it's got a tomato. And do you really think that a hydroponic garden could, in a small space, maybe 6 inches deep by 1.5 feet wide, that it could grow all of those things efficiently? the answer, of course, is no. This is all marketing hype. And so one of the first lessons with hydroponic gardening is, what are you going to grow and how much space do you need? And be very careful when you're looking at getting into hydroponic gardening to look at what it is you're trying to accomplish. These little hydroponic gardens, such as this one, are wonderful for a few herbs in the kitchen, but it's not really suited for a large tomato plant or something of that nature. So, what is hydroponics? Well, it's actually, like most scientific jargon, made up of two Greek words, hydro meaning water, or ponos, which in Greek means work or labor. So it's the work or labor of water to grow plants. Basically, the technique uses water-based nutrient solution rather than soil to grow the plant. So it's in one way much, much cleaner than growing in the outdoors or in pots. It's actually a 300-year-old technique as far as the literature, and some scholars actually think it's a 3,000-year-old technique going back to the floating gardens of Babylon. Well, there's no way that we can actually prove that, but when you read descriptions of the floating gardens, it sounds an awful lot like hydroponic gardening in some form. Let me go back here. They can be operated both indoors as well as outdoors, which makes them unique. Hydroponic gardens can be used to grow virtually any plant. And the picture to the right is actually one of my hydroponic gardens a few years ago. And as you can see, I was growing a tomato plant, and it was quite healthy. In fact, it was so healthy that I was struggling with giving it plant support so that it didn't tip the hydroponic garden over. They can include some type of an aggregate or growing media. The reason I mention this specifically is, if you think about it, when you plant a plant outdoors in the soil, it's anchored to the soil. The soil gives it a place for the roots to hold the rest of the plant. And you have to think about that kind of support for the plant in a hydroponic garden as well. And so it's some type of aggregate or growing media that will anchor the plant to the garden. They can range in size from very small, a single container, to huge agricultural farms. And at the end of the presentation, I'll show a slide which shows the size and scope of some of these hydroponic gardens. One of the biggest reasons that people do hydroponic gardening is for the amount of energy and the amount of space. They can be as much as 100 times more productive than growing in a field. Think about that, 100 times more productive. We all worry about food insecurity in this world. One of the potential solutions to food insecurity is using more hydroponic gardening. Hydroponic gardens oftentimes are thought of as very labor and energy intensive. And the reality is they can be both passive or active energy users. And I'll give an example of a passive hydroponic system in this presentation. They can be operated year-round. Obviously, I'm from Minnesota, and in Minnesota in the middle of winter, you're not going to be doing it outdoors, but you could do it in your basement. You could do it in a heated building. You could do it on your kitchen counter. So it gives you flexibility that you might not have with traditional gardening techniques. They can allow for the extreme control of the environment. So the picture that I have on the screen actually was chose to make the point that you can control almost every aspect of the growing system. In this picture, you see an enclosed space. It has lights that are at a strategic height from the plants. You see a technician who's walking down the walkway, and he has booties on. He has a clean suit on. He's got a hairnet on. He's basically taking every step possible to make sure that he's not introducing anything that could disease the many plants that are growing in this hydroponic system. And most of the commercial growers of any size are actually taking these kinds of steps to make sure that the plants are as productive as they possibly can be. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the various types of hydroponic gardens. And the earliest type, the simplest type, is something called a wick system. In the diagram, you'll see that there are plants in a tray. There's some type of growing media, not soil, but something that's supporting the plant roots. And then there's a wick that goes to a water reservoir. And that wick is drawing moisture up from the reservoir to the growing medium, to the plants, and to the plant roots. In this particular diagram, it also shows an air stone or an air pump that's aerating the water. And one of the nice things about the wick system is you don't really have to aerate the water. The wick itself provides enough air to water contact so that oxygen is transferred to the water as it's being drawn up into the growing medium. It's a great system because it doesn't use a lot of energy. It's a very simple system to use. It doesn't take a lot of parts if you want to set one of them up. The problem with it is it's not ideal for certain types of plants. Plants that take a lot of water. For example, tomatoes need a tremendous amount of water throughout the system, throughout the growing season. And I don't believe that a wick would be able to draw up enough moisture to those hungry roots to support that size of a plant. And so oftentimes with a wick system, you'll see herbs or smaller plants, lettuces, things of that nature that are grown. On the next slide, I actually have some examples of these simple wick systems. On the right, that's a commercial product that you can buy. In this case, it's a peppermint plant that's planted in a mason jar. And inside the mason jar, there's a little plastic container that has a sponge in it. When you get it, the sponge has a few seeds that are added to it. And all you have to do is pour some water into this container, allows the wick that's down in the water to draw up to the sponge, and the plants will germinate and they will grow. Works quite well. The only downside is it's relatively small and you wouldn't want to put a very large plant in it that's going to get very tall and might tip the plant over, or a plant that takes a lot of moisture to grow. If you don't want a commercial system, the picture on the left is actually somebody who took small pots, put them inside of a clear plastic cup, and a wick from the plastic cup down to the water reservoir below, and they're growing plants. So you can make something on your own relatively easily to start hydroponic gardening. The next type I'm going to talk about is called the water culture or the raft system. And this is a system that now starts to take some energy in order to grow your plants. In this case, in the diagram, you can see that there's a reservoir filled with water, and the plants are actually sitting in the water, and the roots of the plants are actually in the water all the time. The plants are suspended. In this case, it's a styrofoam sheet that has the plants suspended on that sheet across the surface, and then an air stone or something that is going to aerate the water below. The plants in this system will grow quite well as long as it's aerated enough to promote healthy growth. The amount of energy is relatively low. Basically, it's something like an aquarium pump to aerate the water below in a smaller wick system. Here's a couple of examples of these water culture or raft systems. The photo on the left is one of my favorites. It actually shows a styrofoam sheet, just like in the diagram on the previous slide, with a type of plant grown through it. Because it's tipped up, you can see the amount of roots that this plant or these plants are producing. And I think a lot of growers forget that what they see above the surface of soil is only half of the plant. Half of it's below the surface. And with this raft system, you get to see exactly how many roots there are growing below the surface. And then the photo on the right is actually a commercial grower who's using this raft system, in this case, to grow a lettuce type. The raft system is quite popular because it is so simple. It just requires the aeration of the water below. And you can use simple things like the styrofoam sheet to float your plants on the surface. And so there are a lot of commercial growers who will actually use the raft system for small plants, such as the lettuces, some herbs, arugulas, and things of that nature. The problem with the system is if the plant gets very big, it gets top heavy, there's not an easy way to support the plants as they get taller. And you can see them collapsing into one another if they get too big. So that's why most times this system is used with relatively low growth plants. The next system that I'm going to mention is something called the ebb and flow system. And as you can see, I'm progressively going from very simple to more complicated systems. This system is one which requires two reservoirs. And as you can see that in this diagram, there's an upper reservoir where a series of plants have been planted. Their roots are periodically bathed in water. In this case, it's a pump that's pumping water up into the upper reservoir. The plants take up the nutrients in the water that they need, and the excess water is then drained into the lower reservoir where there's a pump that on a timer then refills the upper reservoir and then lets it drain back down and then keeps refilling the upper reservoir and letting it drain back down. The nice thing about the system is you don't have to aerate the water because you're not keeping the roots constantly in water. They're actually getting exposure to air because of the flooding and the draining of the system. Downside is you need a mechanical pump to move the materials up. And you also need a timer to time the ebb and flow of the system. One of the things that you have to think about is how often are you going to flood the plants above? And it can be anywhere from several times an hour to several times a day instead of every hour. It depends a little bit on the type of plant that you're growing and how much they will tolerate a wetter environment. It's a flexible system in that you can grow almost any kind of a plant in it. You do have to also, though, think about plant support. So how are you going to support that plant in the growing medium, in the pot that the roots are located? And then how are you going to support the plant as it gets bigger, especially with larger plants, something larger than lettuces, for example. In this slide, I'm showing three different versions of the ebb and flow system. In the left photograph, I have a home grower who's growing some, looks like pepper plants. They're in expanded clay pellets inside of a pot and then inside of a tray that is basically a water reservoir. And periodically, what's happening is a pump is pumping water into the tray on the bottom. The plants are taking up the nutrients in the water that they need below. And then that water is draining back down into a reservoir below the table. In the second photograph, it's actually easier to see the lower reservoir. As you can see, there's a large container that has a couple of pipes going in and out of it. I'm pointing to right here. And one of those is the pipe that's pumping fluid up to the upper reservoir where it bathes the roots of these plants. And one of the pipes is actually the drain where the water is then returning to the lower reservoir. It's that exchange of water that means that you don't have to have aeration with the system if you don't want to. And then the photograph on the far right is actually a large commercial grower that's using the ebb and flow water system. You can see this pipe along the surface, and that's the pipe that's bringing the water in when the pump is turned on. And then the water runs through the growing medium below each of these tomato plants, is drained out through another pipe, which you can't see below, to a reservoir, and then it's recycled through the system. The last type of system that I'm going to mention is something called the nutrient film technique. In this system, it's very much like the ebb and flow system, except that instead of having a timer where you're periodically flooding the upper reservoir, you actually have a pump that is constantly running water through the system. And so the water is going up to the upper system, and then it's slowly draining down into the lower reservoir. In some cases, it's not even direct water that's being pumped. It can be water that then is aerosolized, and a mist is sprayed on the roots of the plants. It collects, then drips down into the reservoir, and then back down to the lower reservoir. That's how these little aeroponic systems that I started the presentation with are actually made. They're actually not running water over the roots. They're actually spraying a light mist on the root system that drips down and then just keeps being repeated through the system. These require more energy and more mechanical systems. You have to have a reservoir pump that's pumping to the upper system, just like you do in the ebb and flow system. And you should try to use some type of an air stone if you're constantly having the roots in water so that there's enough oxygen to create a healthy environment for the plant roots. It's a system that's extremely flexible. It's also a system that a lot of commercial growers will use. In fact, between the three systems, it's about a third, a third, a third between the raft system commercial growers will use, the ebb and flow system, or the nutrient film. And they do it based on the size of their space for the hydroponic system, the amount of energy they want to use, the types of plants that they're trying to grow. And here's some examples of the nutrient film system. In this photograph, you have a reservoir below, and water's being pumped up to this top pipe. It's at a slight angle, and it runs down to a pipe that then takes it down to the next level, and then it runs down, and it just keeps winding its way all the way through this ladder system of pipes. The photo in the bottom left is another type of nutrient system where water is being pumped up into the upper reservoir on this end, and it's slowly draining down the length of the reservoir down to a lower reservoir, and then it's pumped back up, and it just keeps recycling that way. Here's kind of an artistic one. This one is a circular system where water is being pumped up through the central core to the top, and then it enters the system and it slowly comes down and winds its way down to the bottom to a lower reservoir where then it is collected and then it is pumped back up to the surface. And finally, a more simple version. This is actually one of my hydroponic gardens. In this case, I have a reservoir below. There is a pump below and a PVC pipe that I pump the water up to the top container here, where it's dispersed inside the growing medium. There's a series of holes inside of each one of these tiers that drains the water to the tier below, and then to the tier below, and to the tier below, and eventually into the reservoir. Because of that, the water is constantly in contact with air as it's coming down the system. And at the end of the process, I have not had to actually put an aerator in this type of a system because the water has enough air to water relationship that it's actually being naturally aerated. So you're looking at these systems and you're seeing mature plants, but one of the biggest struggles that hydroponic gardeners, and one of the more mysterious things about hydroponic gardening, is how do you get from a seed to something that you can actually plant and grow in one of these hydroponic gardens? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some seed basics. So we all know that a seed is a small version of the mature plant. It has everything contained inside of that seed to grow a mature plant, or to start the process of growing a mature plant. You've got young leaves, you've got an embryonic root, you've got a food supply to get the seed started. Now think about it. If you put a seed like this inside of a hydroponic system, if it was sitting in water, what would happen? It would rot. It would mold. If it did germinate, it would quickly die because of damping off or disease. And so while all plants start from seeds, when you're using a hydroponic system, you have to think a little bit about how you're going to manipulate the natural processes to actually get a plant that you can grow efficiently in the hydroponic system. So what does a seed need to grow? So the first thing is water. Well, guess what? We're growing hydroponically, in other words, with water. So we've got the water piece covered. You need heat. That's universal. All plants need a temperature range consistent with their growing habit. You need light. That's how the plants convert light through photosynthesis to the energy that they need to grow tissue and grow. You need air and you need oxygen. We oftentimes don't think about it completely. We know that the upper part of a plant is in the atmosphere, but we forget about the root system of a plant being below the soil surface. And actually the soil has a lot of oxygen in it. It's not constantly wet. In fact, the easiest way to drive this home is to think about if you've ever overwatered a plant, in other words, it's sitting constantly in water, what happens? They oftentimes die. And it's because the roots don't have enough oxygen, and it promotes diseases and a whole host of problems for the plant. So in a hydroponic system where you're putting water over the roots constantly, you have to think about, how am I going to make sure that those roots get enough oxygen? And in fact, air, oxygen at the roots is probably the most critical thing you can think about in terms of getting a hydroponic system to grow efficiently. The other thing that soil does is it provides support. The small plant starts in the soil, it puts down a root. That root is an anchor point for the plant. It's an anchor point that when the upper part of the plant is growing and blowing in the wind or in the environment, it is anchoring that plant in place. And in a hydroponic system, you have to think about support as well. So the two things that we pay special attention to in a hydroponic system are oxygen and the support of the plant when you're starting the seed, when you're growing the seed, and then once it's starting to mature, how are you going to support the upper part of that plant? So I've tried many different ways of starting plants for hydroponic systems. You can buy commercial products that actually have a little foam piece inside that are pre-seeded with seeds that you can then put in water, let them soak up enough water and germinate the seeds, and then transfer that into your hydroponic system. Or you can even buy kits. So, for example, this is actually a mesh basket that you take these small sponge-like materials, put inside, put a seed inside the center of it, stick it in about a half an inch to an inch of water at the bottom, let it soak up the water, and within 7 to 10 days, depending on the germination rate of the plant, you'll have an embryonic plant that you can then transfer to your hydroponic garden. Another way to do it, which I actually have had better success with, is using rock wool. So rock wool is a product that you can buy in sheets. And as you can see, it's separated into 1-inch squares in these sheets that you get. You put a seed in the center in the little dimple hole, take one of those cubes of rock wool, put it inside the black mesh container that has a wick below it, and give it some water, and you will have a plant that will start to germinate. It's probably the best system I've used simply because you can control the amount of moisture because you're using a wick to get water to the embryonic plant. It's not sitting in water all the time. And so you have a better germination rate and less damping off using this kind of a system than any other. And then the final thing that I've done, which is really labor intensive, but sometimes it's the only thing you can do, is you can wash the roots of a plant. And so the photograph on the bottom is actually a plant that the gardener has taken, put the roots in water, and slowly, carefully removed all the soil from the roots. And now they are going to take that plant and plant that plant in these expanded clay pellets and put it in your garden. I've done this when I'm going to plant tomatoes or peppers, something that I didn't have time to start on my own, or I had a variety that I wanted to grow, but I didn't have the seed for it, but I found it in a garden center. It takes a lot of work because you have to put the plant in water, let it sit for a half an hour or so that the soil gets really loose. And then through a process of agitation and washing, you slowly wash as much of the soil off of the roots of that plant as you can. I've had good success with it. I've also had failures with it because it's really hard on the plant when you're destroying a lot of the micro roots on the bottom of the plant, and it usually sets them back a little bit. But sometimes that's the only solution that you have. Another thing on this slide that I want to mention is something called clone collaring. So some plants you don't have to start from seed. Some plants you can take a small snippet, put it in water, and you can get the plant to grow. And clone collaring is where you'll take a small piece of usually styrofoam or plastic that has a small hole in the center of it, and you plant your cutting in that, put that cutting in water, and you'll let that start to set its roots and eventually transport it over to your hydroponic garden. Works great for plants that can grow from cuttings. Not all plants are suited for that. So there's multiple ways for you to get your plants started for the garden. Talk a little bit about substrates. Substrates being the material that you use to have the roots of the plant sit in. There's a wide range of things that you can use. I've just listed a few of them on this page. One of my favorite, as you have already heard, is rock wool, which is an inorganic material. It doesn't rot. It's very porous. A plant can germinate in it and can stay in it throughout its entire life cycle. Same thing with Oasis cubes. They're very similar. I love expanded clay pellets. They're about 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 inch in diameter. It's clay that's been put in a kiln and dried under extreme temperatures. It's actually a porous material, but hard, so it takes on some moisture, but it's still inert. It doesn't rot or create any disease problems for the plant. One thing that I have tried and I didn't have that great success with is cocoa chips or fiber. I know that a lot of people like using it because it's a organic material. The problem I find with any organic materials is you're already introducing a tremendous amount of water into the process of growing hydroponically. And now if you're going to have constant water running over something like cocoa fibers, you have the possibility of having molds or other plant diseases introduced. And because you're creating an environment for something of that to get started. I've also used perlite, vermiculite, and then the cheapest thing is go down to the shore of your lake or go to a gravel pit and take some rocks of 3/4 to 1 inch size. And when you plant your plants in your hydroponic garden, just plant them among those rocks, which give them enough airspace for water to run through, but also enough weight to anchor the plants in place. The biggest thing is pick something that's long lasting, that allows the plant roots both space as well as support as they're growing. That's why I'm not exactly enamored with cocoa chips or fiber or something that's an organic material. Going to talk a little bit about the lighting that you need to use with hydroponic systems. So first of all, it's based on where your hydroponic system is located. If it's outdoors in a nice sunny spot, you don't need to think about lighting. Like the hydroponic garden I showed you earlier of my own that was sitting outside. I didn't have to have a lighting system. If I moved that inside at the end of the traditional growing season and tried to grow through the winter, then I would have to think about having a lighting system. The best types of lights that are out there right now are LED or fluorescent artificial lights. You need to pick lights that have the right spectrum for the plants, but there's a wide array of those type of lights that are out there. And then you need to space the lights to the plant needs. It's usually just a few inches above the height of the plant or a few inches away from the plant in order to have the most effect. One of the things with hydroponic systems that's difficult is some of them are harder to provide artificial light to than others. For example, towers versus horizontal systems. So in the lower right, I have a horizontal growing system, and you can see there's lights that are horizontally over the top. The problem with this system is some of the plants are 1.5 feet away from the light. Some of the plants are close to the light because they've got different types of plants growing in the same beds. On the lower left, you have a situation where you have a vertical tower hydroponic system. And that's hard to light, although there are now commercial products that are out there, like these light wands that I show in this picture, that you would string around the exterior of the vertical tower in order to create the light that you need for the system. A few other things about lighting. It should be just a few inches from the plant. And when you're thinking about a lighting system for your hydroponic system, think about how you're going to adjust it over time. And the two pictures that I have on this slide show a hydroponic system that, or show a lighting system that would allow you to raise or lower the lights depending on the height of the plants. And the lighting system in the lower left is actually one of my favorite because it's something that I made out of PVC pipe and a simple shop light. So you don't have to spend an awful lot of money to build a lighting system for either your hydroponic system or for any other plants that you're starting in for your gardening needs. The method you use should allow for this adjustment. And the one thing you absolutely do not want to do is put a light source out there that creates a large amount of heat. So traditional incandescent bulbs put out almost as much heat as they did actual light. The good news is fluorescent light tubes and LED lights generate very, very little heat. So they're much, much healthier for plants. Talk a little bit about nutrient solutions. So in a hydroponic system, if you simply put water in them, what would happen over time? The plants would run out of the nutrients that they need to grow. There's certainly a little bit of dissolved salts in almost all water, but they would very quickly run out of those nutrients. They'd run out of the seed nutrients that they had as well. And so you have to add something to the system. Early on in my career, trying hydroponic gardening, before I became a master gardener, I tried using a pelletized fertilizer, leaving it sit in water long enough so that it dissolved, and then put that in the water in the hydroponic system. Well, it didn't work very well, and it didn't work very well because most of those kinds of fertilizers have to have biological interaction to actually make the nutrients available in a form that the plant can take up. So when you fertilize, like in a field, when you put the fertilizer on, it takes 3 to 4 months before that fertilizer is actually available for the plants to take up, which if you used it in a hydroponic system would obviously be too long. So I learned not to do that, but to buy or use a water-soluble fertilizer. Miracle-Gro is one that we all know of, but there are many, many commercial products out there designed just for hydroponic systems. General Hydroponics, which I'm showing in this photograph, has at least a dozen different types of nutrient systems that you can purchase based on the type of plant that you're trying to grow. For example, in the photo, the one on the left has got no nitrogen in it, but it has a lot of potassium and phosphorus. So it's great for flowers or for vegetables. The middle one has got a lot of nitrogen. So if you were going to try to grow something that you want a lot of green growth, you'd probably use that. So the point that I'm trying to make is you pick the nutrient solution that you're going to use based on the type of plants that you're trying to grow throughout the system. The other lesson that I learned about nutrients is over time in a hydroponic system, because you've got water in contact with air constantly moving, you're going to have water loss. And so every couple of days, you have to check the water reservoirs to make sure that you have enough water in those reservoirs. Well, a couple of things can happen. As the water evaporates, what's happening to the nutrients? They're getting more and more concentrated inside of what's left of the reservoir. So keeping the reservoir at the right depth so that the nutrient solution is at the right strength is important. The other thing is, because of that water loss, all of us gardeners, our tendency is to just keep fertilizing. We think fertilizing more is going to help. Well, if you keep adding more nutrient solution all the time to your water reservoir and you're having this loss to evaporation effect, what you're doing is you're just constantly increasing the amount of nutrients in that water to the point where it can actually become toxic for the plants. And I have had a failure because I had over fertilized the nutrient solution for the plants that I was trying to grow. I did solve it by adding a lot of water and basically thinned out the nutrient solution. And it was really, counterintuitive that I had plants that one day looked like they were going to die because they were over fertilized. And within a couple of days of adding more water and taking away a lot of the nutrients, they looked much, much better. So in other words, follow the directions on any nutrient solution package that you might purchase. The last thing I'll say about nutrient solutions is do not use fish emulsion. So a lot of master gardeners, a lot of gardeners in general, love fish emulsion. They use it all summer long on their gardens. The problem with fish emulsion is, first of all, you put it in water, it's a smelly proposition. If you're going to have a hydroponic garden inside your house, I don't think you want it smelling like fish emulsion inside your house or inside an enclosed space. The second thing is it can attract unwanted guests in the case of insects as well as animals. I've got a personal story about it. We have a home in the Brainerd Lakes area, had a hydroponic garden sitting outside that I was using some fish emulsion in. And one day I'm walking out by the hydroponic garden and I see a plant that's on the ground and it had been pulled out of the hydroponic garden. And I thought, bird or something. So it wasn't dead yet. So I picked it up. I made a hole in the substrate, replanted the plant. Next day I go out and there's now 2 or 3 plants that are pulled out. What was happening is we had a local dog who was coming by and he loved that fish emulsion. And so he was pulling all of these plants out because they smelled good to him. So fish emulsion and hydroponic systems outdoors doesn't work very well, at least in my opinion. Let's talk a little bit about aeration. So aeration, it just means you're adding oxygen to the water. It's the same thing we do with fish tanks. So if you've ever had an aquarium, you know you have to have some type of an aeration system for most plants. And that's actually what most people use, is some type of a aquarium aeration system. And in fact, the two pictures that I have on the screen are an air stone as well as a waterfall aeration system from a fish tank. The nice thing about the wick system is you don't have to have aeration. With a water culture or the raft systems, you definitely need to have some type of a aeration system, and that would be something like the air stone or the waterfall aeration system. In the ebb and flow and the nutrient film systems, you may not need it. It depends on how you designed the system or how the system you designed is functioning. It's really a matter of how long are the roots of the plant in water. If they're constantly in water, you've got to aerate. If there's a period of time where all or part of the roots are exposed to air or exposed to oxygenated water, you don't need to have an aeration system. The one thing to think about is an aeration system is never going to hurt. It's never going to hurt. And so if you just want to be safe, add some type of an aeration system to any one of these systems. Location. So in this picture, I have somebody who has a hydroponic system. It looks like it is a raft system with an aerator out on their deck. And all they did is they took a container, cut some holes in the lid, took some plant pots, rock, and then planted some plants in there. The roots sitting in the nutrient rich water below that's aerated by the aquarium pump. About as simple a system as you can possibly have. And it's in a nice location. It's outside, it doesn't need lighting, it gets some breeze. It's on a deck so that if there's a little spill of water here or there, it's not going to create a problem. The other thing is it's in a corner, so it's safe from traffic, from pets, drafts, excessive heat, cold, all the things you should think about anyway when you're placing plants. I really want to stress it's got to be in a place where spills won't do any damage. The reason is all of these systems use a lot of water and you're going to have spills whenever you're working with water. Provide enough space for the plants as they grow. In this example, these are pretty healthy plants. They're growing pretty big. There's plenty of space for them to grow. But you don't want to plant a tomato plant in one of those aeroponic systems that's only about a foot tall on your counter. You're never going to have enough space for that tomato plant. And that's why you've got to really think through what it is you're trying to grow with these systems. You want it where the air temperature is above 60 degrees. That's kind of the minimum temperature for active growth during our summers. And then the last thing is don't overlook basements. We always forget about the fact that they're a nice humid environment. They're climate controlled. Usually they're at 60 degrees or more. They're usually out of traffic patterns. They're usually away from animals or other things that can harm the plants. So basements can be a wonderful place for a hydroponic system. The other things you should think about, it's easy access to water. You should have easy access to power, especially if you're using any of the systems that require pumps or aeration or timers. You're going to need power for grow lights as well, maybe a heat mat, maybe fans or humidifiers. In the picture, I'm trying to make the point of my last bullet point, which is some location issues can be moderated by enclosures. So in this picture, you've got somebody who's growing cannabis inside an enclosed space that has silver foil, so it's magnifying the amount of light that's being put out, and it's in a hydroponic system that was actually built in like a Home Depot container, like the picture I had shown before. So a lot of these systems for home growers can be handmade. Things to think about, probably in order of importance from my standpoint: good quality water. So if you're on city water, think about not using that city water. Think about getting enough water from another source that's good quality, because you don't want chlorine and some of the other things that's in the city water necessarily in your hydroponic system. You got to think about what substrate you're going to use. In other words, what's the growing material that the roots are going to be sitting in? What kind of containers are you going to use? What nutrient solutions, lights, pumps, timers? And you even get down to things like a fan to move air around and strengthen the plants a little bit, take care of any humidity issues in wherever you're running your hydroponic garden, and then a dehumidifier in some places. I've seen a lot of people with hydroponics in basements where they have to run a dehumidifier because the basement is already humid. Now you're adding more water because you're running a hydroponic system in the basement. So you need the dehumidifier to sort of balance things out. Finally, I'm going to spend a little time on this slide. 4 different commercial types of hydroponic systems. So on the lower left is Freight Farms. Freight Farms is a commercial company that actually sells basically shipping container sized hydroponic gardens that you can have delivered almost anywhere across the country. And as you can see, this one's built out to handle a lot of plants in one location. And the lower right is actually a picture from Disney World, where they grow most of the green foods that they use in all of the Disney property restaurants. We always think about these things as being a long ways away from Minnesota. Well, Faribault Living Green Farm is the picture in the upper right. They have one of the largest hydroponic gardens in the state. And then I've left the picture on the upper left without a caption for right now. It's a beautiful, sterile type of garden. It's very light. It's very airy. It's probably in the last place you would think. It's actually buried 200 feet under the surface of London, and it's in a World War II bomb shelter. For the last 20 years, a lot of the greenery and greens that are used in restaurants and sold in grocery stores in London come from these converted bomb shelters from World War II. I just think it's fascinating that they've figured out a way to repurpose those bunkers and turn them into a very productive garden space. Some resources if you want to learn more about this. The one in particular I'd point you to is the House 2 from the University of Minnesota Education, Small Scale Hydroponics. It is a wonderful resource to get you started in hydroponic gardening. There's a ton of material out on the web. Every one of these resources is actually from a accredited university, and I strongly suggest you go to university education resources if you're going to do any research, because there is so much out on the internet that isn't accurate. As Brittany mentioned, I'm a Crow Wing County Master Gardener with the University of Minnesota Extension Service. We have a number of priorities that we follow. If you're interested in the Master Gardening Program, please contact either Brittany or myself. We'd love to have you join our program. And as you can see, we have a number of priorities, all designed to serve the people of Minnesota in some form or another. And then I'm going to finish with, if you've got a question about any gardening topic, we've also got the Ask a Master Gardener helpline that you can either access through this phone number or through an email. And a Master Gardener will try their best to answer your questions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany, who I think has got some questions in chat that we're going to try to answer.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much, Dan. Maybe we'll start off, excuse me, we do have questions in the chat, but does anybody in person have a question they want to ask Dan quick? Nothing in person yet, so I'll go to the chat. Can you hear me okay, Dan?
I can.
Okay, good. All right, so first question is in regard to the raft system. Do we need to be concerned with any chemical leaching from the styrofoam?
I've seen a couple of articles written about certain products that will have chemical leaching, but styrofoam is one that seems relatively safe from the literature. And I personally wouldn't worry about it. In fact, I actually would recommend it simply because it's so easy to work with. It's easy to cut, it's long lasting, it's inert as far as it won't promote the growth of anything on it. So I would recommend styrofoam and would not be concerned about chemical leaching.
Okay, thank you. Moving on with the aeroponic, I think this was the nutrient film system. Do the spray nozzles clog very often?
One of the reasons you want a good quality water and you want to use a really good quality nutrient solution is you want clean water that's going through those systems, because the nozzles can and will clog. And even though the nutrient solution itself may not have large enough particles to clog the nozzle, think about whenever you have a faucet, sometimes you get a crust at the bottom of the faucet where things will leach out of the water and start to crust. So that happens with some of those nozzle systems as well. It's not a big deal to clean them, but it can happen. It's something you should watch for.
Okay, thank you. With the ladder system, do the first level of plants only absorb what they need for nutrients? Does the last level receive the same amount of nutrients in the solution, or is it diluted?
So because you're circulating the water on a continual basis, all the plants are getting the same amount of nutrient solution. It's just passing over the roots as it's finding its way down to the bottom. Think about those systems in terms of probably takes a minute or two for the water to go from the top to the bottom, because it's moving at a fairly rapid pace because of the way water moves. So I would not worry about a different amount of nutrients being absorbed at the top versus the bottom.
Okay, thank you. Next question, can you reuse rock wool once your plant has run its course to start a new plant in the same cube?
I suppose you could, but rock wool, if you've grown a mature plant in it, the mature plant will probably have broken the rock wool apart, and you probably just have fragments of rock wool left at the end. And I would be a little worried about transferring any diseases that might have started to manifest themselves in the previous plant and having that pass over to the next one. So I would always start fresh with a new rock wool cube.
Okay. Are all the substrates listed in the slide compostable / recyclable?
The answer to that, I had to think back to that slide. The answer is
Yeah.
yes. Yes.
Okay.
All of them are natural products. Vermiculite or the clay pellets are actually natural clay that's just been expanded in a kiln. Rocks, all the rest of them are compostable.
Great. Question, what would you suggest to hydroponically grow tomatoes outside? I'm thinking that is what kind of system would you suggest?
I personally like the nutrient film technique. The reason I like the nutrient film technique is you can, as you saw in the picture that I have, you can have a fairly compact reservoir below. You can have a fairly robust pot that the plant is sitting in, and you're constantly running the nutrient material over the roots of the plant. So you know that it's getting enough nutrients and enough water all the time. In the raft system, the plants get too big. A tomato plant in particular would be too big for a raft system. And in the ebb and flow system, I'd worry about things like how much the roots are going to fill up the reservoir. One of the horror stories that I experienced with my wife was growing a tomato in our hydroponic system. And one day we go out there and the water is overflowing from one of the levels. Well, what had happened is the roots had gotten so big in the plant that it had clogged all the drain holes into the lower reservoir. So we had to almost tear the plant apart to remove some of the roots from the base to allow the water to run back down into the lower reservoir. So I would use probably the nutrient film system, but I'd limit it one or two plants to one reservoir so that you're managing the amount of vertical growth as well as root growth to the system. Hope that made sense.
All right, thank you. A couple of kind of involved questions here. Is there a database listing what light spectrum is best for each plant you're growing? Probably just, yeah, go ahead.
I believe the University of Minnesota Extension has some materials on that very topic so that you can go to University of Minnesota Extension Ed, and I believe there is such a tool on the extension site.
Okay, thank you. How are people pollinating tomato plants in their home? Are larger scale facilities using bees to pollinate flowering fruit plants?
Excellent question.
Wow.
We've got a gardener who asked that question. So one of the reasons that I grew tomatoes outdoors during the summer was I didn't have to worry about pollination because I had natural pollination by wind and insects. If you're indoors, what they are doing is things like putting a toothbrush, electric toothbrush, on the stems of the tomato plant and running it for a period of time where it's shaking at a high vibration rate the vines of the plant, which is shaking loose some of the pollen and pollinating some of the plants. Sometimes they take a Q-tip and will actually individually pollinate flowers. But that is one of the problems associated with growing something like a tomato indoors that requires pollination.
All right, good one.
By the way, at St. Cloud State, where I was a botany student, we actually pollinated indoor plants that weren't hydroponic using an electric toothbrush as far back as 40 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I am having a hard time locating food safe PVC. Any recommendations? I know we're not really recommending sources necessarily.
I'm trying to think of any place locally in Crow Wing County, and I don't think I've seen any food safe PVC mentioned there. I personally have never really looked that hard for food safe PVC because it's a relatively safe um, product to begin with. But I suppose you could do a web search for food grade PVC.
Yeah. All right. Looking at seed selection, do you use regular garden seeds or do you need to look for hydroponic specific seed?
You can use any seed. You can, I don't think I mentioned it, but you can grow absolutely any plant hydroponically if you set yourself up for it. You could even grow a palm tree if you wanted to hydroponically. So no special seeds necessary.
All right. And then some questions about the resources that you listed. I will share those electronically. Are they on your handout, Dan? I forget.
I do not believe they are.
Okay, so I'll just share those by email and then and get them out to people. We had people taking pictures of your slides here in person. And then, yep, we have a link to the plant growing guide, light spectrum. And then kind of back to the food safe PVC question.
Yes.
Is NST 5.1 or NST 6.1 safe for food plants?
That is a question beyond my expertise at this moment. I'd have to do some research.
Yep, might have to do some research on that one. All right, I think we made it through the chat questions. Any other?
I have one.
Okay.
I got one of the small countertop systems with this specific goal to use them as starters to put out in like my ground dirt garden.
Yep.
Would that work well?
Were you able to hear the question, Dan?
Not all of it.
Okay, I'll kind of re-say it. So the question is, if someone were to purchase one of the, you know, pre-made systems that you showed at the beginning of the slide, like at the beginning of the presentation, if they were to use that to start plants and then move them outside, would that be a good process?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's actually a really nice idea if you can afford to have basically a starter hydroponic system that you're then transferring to your more mature system.
Okay, and I think she's actually going to be moving to the dirt, right? Yep. Would that be doable?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Moving to dirt, probably like any other plant, maybe just a
Because I
hardening off.
seeds in dirt inside to save my life.
Okay.
Yeah.
He has trouble starting seeds in dirt inside, so this might be a new system for you.
That's an interesting workaround. It's the only problem is going to be you only can start as many plants that way as they have slots in the system. Usually there, 8 slots is pretty common. So 8 plants at a time.
She has an 18 slot
Wow.
system getting delivered today, she says, so. Exciting, yep. One more question on a good wick material.
Any kind of a cotton or wool material. I've even seen thick candle wicks used as a wick.
Okay. All right, so the webinar notes, we will share the handout electronically. It's also linked in the chat. Another question coming through, what would you recommend for an efficient system when it comes to utilizing space? A tower system or horizontal tubing system? Will be indoors, so lighting is needed.
So I personally think the most efficient systems are vertical wall systems, where an entire wall will basically be a living wall. The reason I think it's efficient is it's out of traffic. It only takes maybe a foot or two along a wall to grow it. The only downside to them is how do you light them?
Yep. Okay. And so he's asking, would that be a drip system along the wall that you're talking about?
That would be an NFT or a nutrient filmed system where it pumps fluid to the top that then drips down through the wall to the reservoir at the bottom.
All right. Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
The system that he used outside, it was like the terracotta one.
Yep.
Is that a system that he made or purchased?
Your terracotta system outside, Dan, did you make that or purchase it?
That one is actually was the first one that I started using. It's called a Grow Up system. It's commercially available on a number of websites. It's actually a nice system. It's easy to use. The only thing that you learn over time is it's really easy to plant too many plants in there that are going to get too big. So for example, one year I planted a couple of tomatoes, some peppers, as well as a watermelon in it. And you know, the great example of how efficient they are, I had watermelon vines all the way around the base of it. It was hard to actually get close to it to put water in at the end of the season. So just got to be careful with it, what size plants you're trying to grow. And the other systems that you saw pictures of are oftentimes ones that I've put together using parts from different suppliers as I've gotten more comfortable with doing hydroponic systems. And the flyer that Brittany put in the chat as well as handed out actually diagrams out a small system that you can easily build.
Okay, thank you. All right. Any last questions? I'll add the handout one more time into the chat. But other than that, any last questions? All right. All right, thanks so much, Dan. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I'll send you all the feedback and wrap up, so. All right.
Can you email me a shot of all those university connections you have?
How hard is it to grow okra?
Okra?
In Minnesota.
Oh, just put it in a pot.
I put it in a tree stump, it came out.
Oh, did it?
I grow it for the flower.
Got a couple of plants and got a couple of things on the ground.
I mean, it likes warmer weather and a little longer growing season, so that might.
We had a watermelon, my mom had a watermelon, one seed out on the field, and it basically grew this whole plant.
Oh
of
my gosh,
okra.
must have had good soil.
Yeah.
All right.
Florida, so do you have, I put my email. I have you back there, but can you send, I was taking pictures of it, like it was easier by just ask, like, yeah, that'd be better.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll send it to
You
you.
can do
It should send, sometimes if they're too long, but it might not, but
I
it
would
should.
think it would.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, yeah, thanks for leaving your email.
I think I'll be dropping something off. I have the buckthorn pruning in winter. I don't know if it's,
Yeah.
but if you could add a picture, I can never get a picture.
Yeah.
So I just printed that in I'm, when I go home and double check, I may need more EAB. There is only one left on the kiosk this morning when I checked, so.
And what did you say you wanted an email?
Just that last slide where he had all the resources. And just in case.
Yes.
Thank you.
To that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'll send it to you.
Okay.
We post the recordings there. And usually once it's done, we'll link to the recording on, like, we'll put it on Facebook. Because I look at something, so it might take a few days.
What Facebook page specifically?
Master Gardeners,
So if I look at Master Gardeners,
or Crowway Master Gardeners.
okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
for coming.
Yeah.
Retirement.